Joining me now is David Sirota. He's a journalist, columnist, editor, and former Bernie Sanders speechwriter and senior advisor, as well as the founder of the Daily Poster, a grassroots-funded investigative journalism project that covers politics, business, and corporate power. David, thanks so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure is ours. Listen, I'm kind of glad that we were not able to connect on Friday because over the weekend you published an article, The American Rescue Plan's Money Cannon is Great, but Not Enough. And you went through the good and the bad and the ugly of this particular policy, of this legislation. And I actually appreciate how you contextualized it in terms of giving credit where credit is due, but not overstating it. Tell us about that particular article as well as your analysis.
Sure. I think the stimulus bill, the American Rescue Plan, it's indisputable from my perspective that the spending in the bill is really important. That the part of the bill that spends money on programs that exist, on unemployment insurance, a new child tax credit, all of that is important. It's necessary. It's good. It's direct aid to people. I think I read a stat that about 40 to 45% of the entire bill is just cash out the door to regular people. There's another portion of the bill that goes to state and local governments, also important. So I think overall, the spending of the bill is really important, and it represents a victory over the austerity ideology that has dominated politics for the last 30 to 40 years, which is to say that kind of idea that we can't spend money to help people, that we have to only first and foremost think of the deficit and the national debt in conventional ways, that this bill, a $1.9 trillion bill, I think represents a victory over that really bad ideology. By the way, a much bigger victory than the Obama stimulus bill 11 or 12 years ago. That was $787 billion. That was too small for the economic crisis we were facing then. And ultimately, it helped deliver the weakest economic recovery in the post-World War II era. I think this bill, when it comes to spending, is much bigger, much more up to the task, much more adequate and appropriate to the situation. So that's the good. The bad is that the bill did not include much of anything to begin fundamentally restructuring the economy to make the economy as a whole more fair. Also, the spending in the bill, at least for now, is temporary. So it's a one-shot, for now, bridge through the crisis. Again, extremely important, but it's not permanent spending to permanently help lift people out of poverty. And again, the bill did not include things like the minimum wage increase, or tax reform to begin making the economy itself more fair. And then the ugly is that the bill included some spending that will actually make it harder to reform the healthcare system. Instead of putting a public health insurance option into this bill, a public health insurance option was promised by Joe Biden. It was promised by every Senate candidate running for Senate in 2020. Instead of putting that in there to start restructuring the healthcare economy, the bill spends about $40 or $50 billion to simply subsidize people to get private health insurance on the ACA exchanges. So essentially fortifying and strengthening the private insurance industry, an industry that those exchanges, by the way, we have seen insurance companies deny 1 out of every 6 claims, medical claims, when you're on an ACA exchange. The ACA private insurance plans are marked by higher and higher out-of-pocket costs for people who are being covered. Is coverage better than nothing? Sure. Could the bill have included a public health insurance option or extended Medicaid or Medicare? And it didn't? Yeah, right. It did not. It excluded those things. It put into the bill the lobbyists' plan, and we reported that at the Daily Poster, that literally healthcare lobbyists put together this plan. This was their proposal, and that was put into the rescue plan. And again, it strengthens the power of the private insurance industry. And I would argue politically makes it harder to argue now, moving forward. Now we have to do Medicare for all or a public option or something that's much better.
Right, right. All right, so let's unpack it a little bit. Actually, before we unpack it, let's talk about the politics of it. Right, let's talk about the machinations that were necessary, the reconciliation in order to make it happen, particularly as it pertains to anything else. Right, we aren't going to get the help of Republicans on anything that is meaningful, and so the question now becomes moving forward for any legislation. Is the Biden administration going to be willing to address the filibuster, or are we going to now be pigeonholed to only being able to use the same technique when we have the opportunity presents itself? What do you think about that?
Well, that's a really good question, and that's why it's so important. That's why it was so important to try to put some of these things that I just talked about in this bill, right? I mean, I've heard some people say, "Well, why do you need a minimum wage increase in the American Rescue Plan? Why do you need a public health insurance option in the American Rescue Plan? They can do that later." Now, first and foremost, I would argue that healthcare reform and raising the minimum wage is actually important to rescue people right now. It is a short term, but what was it that half of people who work in minimum wage jobs, those are jobs that are considered essential for the country, essential for getting through the pandemic. But even if you accept the notion, okay, listen, somehow the minimum wage or the public health insurance option don't need to be in this particular bill because they're not necessarily part of short-term stimulus. The problem with that argument is that this bill was brought up under the reconciliation process, and under existing Senate rules, as you allude to, the reconciliation process, which can only be used in very limited cases, but the reconciliation process allows legislation to pass through the Senate on a simple majority vote. So the point, in just the straight up political point, in terms of the Senate rules of adding something like the minimum wage or a public health insurance option to this bill, was that this was one of the only bills under existing Senate rules that could pass with only 51 Senate votes. So anything that's not in this bill under existing Senate rules and outside of another reconciliation process, which for sure could happen in 1 year from now, in the next congressional year. But anything other than that has to basically typically face a 60 Senate threshold, a 60 vote Senate threshold, which is the filibuster. So there's this, we'll put a standalone minimum wage bill on the floor, next week. Well, the Republicans have enough votes to filibuster. So that's a long way of saying, if you do not get rid of the filibuster, then anything that wasn't in the American Rescue Plan faces a much more difficult path to ever seeing the light of day. Biden has, up until now, said he does not support necessarily reforming the filibuster, but he's starting to change that. I saw a comment, I think yesterday, his chief of staff on, I think it was Mehdi Hassan's show, started alluding to the idea that Biden maybe doesn't want filibuster reform, but wouldn't necessarily stand in its way. Now you have Joe Manchin, who has said he would never support getting rid of the filibuster. Now he's at least saying that maybe they could tweak the filibuster to require it to be what's known as a talking filibuster. Right now, there's not just a filibuster. The filibuster is made easy. Any senator can just sort of say, "Hey, I'm holding up this bill, and I don't really have to do much of anything other than say I'm holding up this bill." Manchin's talking about bringing back the old talking filibuster, where in the days of old, if you wanted to filibuster a bill, you had to stand on the floor of the Senate for hours and hours and hours to try to stop the bill. So there are potential ways to reform the filibuster that could break this logjam.
Yeah. And I'm thinking I watched that clip. It was Mehdi Hassan and Biden's chief of staff. And it was as it pertained to HR 1, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They have when I say they, Joe Biden has a real problem ahead of him, right? Yeah. Because there's an all out assault against voting rights across this country. But also there is a very clear demand from Black people in particular to protect our voting rights. And so do you think by them positioning themselves, and Joe Manchin understands that he's going to be on the wrong side of that argument too, which is why I think he's trying to find a way to prevaricate there. But do you think turning the filibuster into a talking filibuster, meaning that they actually have to stand there and filibuster like they used to versus just putting a hold on legislation, do you think that's going to be sufficient enough to get major legislation through, like the John Lewis Voting Act?
It's a good question. I really don't know. I mean, I think that it's hard for me to see a way that something like the voting rights initiatives pass through the Senate without a true reform of the filibuster, not just sort of making it a little bit harder. I mean, certainly making it harder to filibuster would be good. All of these steps would be good. But it's hard for me to see a full way around this unless they change the rules of the Senate. And look, right. I do think that, the concern about getting rid of the filibuster is what happens when Mitch McConnell is Senate Majority Leader again. What would the Republicans do without a filibuster? And I think we know what they would do. I mean, they would pack the courts. They would do all the things that we know that they would do. So is there a concern that if you create this power, somebody's going to use this power for really evil things? Yes, there is. But I think that the idea that the American government can't respond to things anymore because it allows a tyranny of the minority in the U.S. Senate, meaning the minority party, right? That basically 41 senators can stop anything. I mean, that is not good for American governance. I mean, I think there was a stat a couple of years ago that right now, for people to understand just how unbelievable the filibuster is, right? The Senate is an undemocratic institution unto itself, right? Wyoming has as many Senate votes as California. So fundamentally undemocratic institution. And then you add to the filibuster for it. And it's basically that one way I calculated it is 41 Senate votes representing 11% of the population can stop anything. So 11% of the people's representatives in the Senate have enough Senate power to stop anything they want. That's way beyond being like undemocratic. That's basically autocratic, right? That's not even close. And I know we don't live in a direct democracy, but that doesn't respect the democratic foundations of living in a republic.
Right. And so the some of the problems, and I hear you alluding to them, is the fact that there's the fear, obviously, of what Republicans will do, but then we've also seen what Republicans do anyway, even with the filibuster, right? They still have, and because I think I can summarize what I'm thinking right here, and I would like for you to address it. Republicans have power because they're absolutists and they don't give an inch. Right? They understand the power of moving as a political bloc when they're in the majority and when they're in the minority. And yet we still have Democrats who become stumbling blocks. Manchin, Sinema come to mind, right? There's more. You had the 8 that voted against the $15 an hour minimum wage. Why is it that the Democratic Party is incapable of moving as a bloc in a solidified way to get done what they need to get done, whether they're in the majority or the minority, and Republicans have been able to forward their agenda nonstop, relentlessly, regardless of if they're in the majority or the minority?
Well, I think it's because the Democratic Party is frankly a bigger tent, if you will. I think that the party, its ideological foundation is a much broader ideological foundation than the Republicans. I mean, the Republicans have essentially purged themselves of so-called moderates. They've purged the party of anybody who doesn't adhere to that right-wing political ideology. The Democratic Party is a much more diverse party, ideologically diverse, demographically diverse, and there's a lot of upsides to that. The downside is that when the party needs to behave, as you say, when the party needs to behave as a bloc, it becomes more difficult. I do think what's disturbing. Let's go back to the $8 minimum wage. Or excuse me, the eight senators who voted against the $15 minimum wage. What's disturbing is what the party cannot behave as a fully unified bloc on. There are certain things. So like the fact that there were 8 Senate Democrats to vote against something that should be as foundational as raising the minimum wage, that really signals it's not just an ideological diversity, that there is potentially a ideological division in a sense that's problematic. Will that division exist when it comes to voting rights? I don't know. I think you're going to see some of these senators that you mentioned, Joe Manchin, maybe Kristen Sinema, try to separate their views on the filibuster from their views on the specific issues. But those things are inseparable, right? Like there's going to be an effort to say, look, I support the voting rights stuff, but I support necessarily fully getting rid of the filibuster because I believe in the so-called the institution. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is that ultimately you cannot separate those things, right? That those things are all connected. You cannot support an undemocratic institution that will not allow things to move forward and then pretend that you care about the specific things that need to move forward. You cannot say, I support a minimum wage, I support voting rights, I support all of these other progressive priorities, but I also support fortifying and keeping in place the barrier to any of those things happening, right? That is in fundamental conflict. And ultimately, these senators are going to have to choose. It's the old saying from organized labor. They're going to have to choose which side they are on.
Absolutely. David Sirota, journalist, columnist, and founder of the Daily Poster. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me anytime.